Just a reminder, this is another discussion group week, so you will meet in the same place, same time. For discussion groups, we'll be looking at the ancestral stories this time. And today we're going to take up the ancestral stories. The last lecture, we looked at the way that the priestly writer has modified the underlying Yahwist narrative through the simple process of adding large blocks of additional material before and after. And so where in the Yahwist narrative, the creation seems to be a somewhat experimental enterprise. God does not know exactly how all this is coming out. It does not turn out well. God tries to fix it. It doesn't stay fixed. So there is a general dissatisfaction on the part of the Yahwist, apparently, with the human condition. This is just the way things are. God has allowed a creation to exist that permits people to react honestly to the creation itself. So putting it in theological terms, God has created people with free will, and that seems to be the way God wants it. Could, the medievals would have asked, could God have created a world in which there was no free will and everybody did exactly what they wanted to do? And the answer obviously is yes, God could have, but God did not do that, according to the Yahwist. God seems to want something else from this creation, although the Yahwist is not yet clear just what that something else may be. And we will see that at the very beginning of the ancestral stories, with the Abraham narrative, God gives a command to Abraham that leads to a promise to Abraham and his descendants, but there is a big requirement that God puts on it. If you will do this, then I will do something else. So if Abraham will go to the land that is as yet unrevealed, and presumably God knows where they are going, but Abraham does not, and yet he goes. And according to the Yahwist laying out of the ancestral stories, it is this process which is ultimately going to lead to the fulfillment of the promise to the ancestors. And that's going to be a major theme in all of the literary sources as they proceed from chapter 12 of Genesis on through eventually the book of Joshua, when the land that had been promised is finally given to the Israelites. Theologically, Funrod was right that the promise requires the book of Joshua for its fulfillment. That does not necessarily mean that originally we had a 6-book document that traced this. But theologically, that is necessary for the fulfillment of the promise. The promise does not get fulfilled in any other way. So the creation itself seems to, according to the Yahwist, seems to be or have based within it some kind of innate evil on the part of humans. People can do what they like, and what they like is frequently not what the deity wants them to do. And that's amply illustrated in the primeval history, as the Yahwist tells the story. The priestly writer wants you to take away something else from the primeval history. And so we looked at chapter 1 with the great care in which the priestly writer lays out the story of creation. And there is in chapter 1 this repeated insistence that the entirety of creation is good. And that includes these people. There is nothing innately wrong with the creation, and there is nothing innately wrong with people. In fact, the priestly writer tells us The people were created in the divine image after the divine likeness. And that theme then gets worked out in a series of genealogies that the priestly writer adds to chapters 1 through 11 to show the transmission of the divine image genetically through a series of firstborn children in exactly the way that inheritance was thought to run in the priestly writer's time. And so every time we get engrossed in the Yahwist narrative and the wonderful storytelling features of that narrative, the way in which the writer is able to say a great deal in a very small and simple way, the priestly writer breaks in from time to time to remind us that this is not the entire story. People are still in the divine image, and if we doubt that, after the flood, God promises never to destroy the earth again. That promise is taken over from the Yahwist. The Yahwist expresses it in different language, but both of them have the idea that God is not going to do that. But they have different ideas about why God is not going to do it. You saw when you looked at the flood narrative that for the Yahwist, people are simply built this way, and there's nothing much you can do about it. And God did not succeed in solving the problem by wiping out everybody except the family of Noah, because as long as you leave one of these sinful humans alive, it's going to spread again. So the priestly writer does not believe that for a moment, and hastens to tell you that Noah was a righteous person in his generation. This is just a flat-out contradiction to the way that the Yahwist sees the story. And so at the end of the flood narrative, God promises, as God does in the Yahwist narrative, not to try the flood thing again. That did not work. God recognized it didn't work, and therefore maybe God has some other things, as the old gospel song says, no more water but the fire next time. So maybe God has other ways of going about this, and that's simply implied in the Yahwist narrative without giving you any of the details. But God presumably could respond in some other way. Not so with the priestly writer. The priestly writer believes that Noah was righteous in his generation, and therefore the people generally are righteous because they bear the divine image, and the priestly writer is not going to give up on that. Therefore, you simply have to write off the idea of the flood as a bad idea on God's part. God is not going to do this again, and in order to bind the deity to that promise not to destroy the earth again, God, in the priestly writer, gives us the first account of a covenant between people and the entirety of creation. It's not just the people, as it is in the Yahwist. It's the entirety of creation. God is not going to try to destroy the creation again. God has a special relationship, we are told, with the whole created order. We find this in chapter 9, verse 8, beginning around verse 8, and it goes on at some length. This is the first of the covenants that we will run into in the narratives. It's going to become an important theological idea, and we'll run into it a couple of times in the Abraham story, and later on it will be connected with the promise of land and descendants. We're not going to go into it in great detail here today. We will do that when we take up the Sinai covenant, which is really the super covenant. As far as the priestly writer is concerned, it is the obligations that people owe under covenant. What you should notice about these other covenants, including the one with the entirety of creation, and that's important to notice. This is verse 9 now. I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, the beasts of the earth. This is echoing chapter 1. The priestly writer does not want to leave anything out. It is a covenant with the entire created order. And so God has a special relationship not only to people, but to the earth in its entirety, which sounds like an extremely modern idea. But here it is in the work of the priestly writer. And this is the sign of the covenant, which I make between me and you and every living creature. I will set my bow in the cloud, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And when I bring clouds over the earth, the bow is seen in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will look upon it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature and all flesh upon the earth. This is the sign of the covenant which I have established. Now, what you notice about this, and you will see it in some of the other covenants we're about to look at in the Abraham story as well, there is no quid pro quo here in this covenant. That is to say, covenants are mutual obligation agreements that grow out of international law originally. And in this case, the idea is adapted to fit the relationship between people or the world in its entirety, in the case of the priestly writer, and the deity. But notice that only the deity in this version of the covenant, only the deity has obligations under this agreement. The people are not explicitly said to have obligations. That's going to come later, and the priestly writer will immediately interpret the Sinai legislation as the main statement of the obligations that people have under covenant. Sinai, of course, happens only after the people have been delivered from slavery in Egypt. And it is that act of graciousness on God's part which becomes the rationale for God's ability to impose obligation under covenant for the people. So that's the way that's finally going to work out. We'll look at that in greater detail later on. We do have a problem, however, when we look at the way the priestly writer edits the first 11 chapters of Genesis. As you've already seen, looking at the flood narrative, and for that matter, the genealogical material in these chapters, that there is outright contradiction in the first 11 chapters between the Yahwist and the priestly writer. The big one, of course, theologically, is an anthropological distinction between the two. The Yahwist believes in that people have free will and that people therefore can do evil as well as good. They do not live in a perfect world because they are not perfect themselves. The priestly writer denies that premise theologically. People are good and were created good. The creation was created good. There is no evil in this creation, the priestly writer tells you. So you have a major theological difference there. And genealogically, you have the oddity in the Yahwist of the people after the first murder descended from the first murderer. Cain is the father of all of the rest of the people, according to the Yahwist. This is too much for the priestly writer. The priestly writer does not believe that for a moment and cannot bring himself to trace the lineage of people through Cain. So suddenly a new character is introduced, a third child of Adam and Eve, namely Seth, about whom otherwise we know absolutely nothing, and who will not appear at all in this narrative, although post-biblical texts are going to make a great deal out of Seth, precisely because we don't know anything about him. Whenever that happens, you can bet that the later tradition is going to expand considerably on what we can say about Seth. And it is through Seth, according to the priestly writer, that the rest of humankind was eventually traced. So it is a different genealogical line, and it becomes a major contradiction within the genealogical material in chapter 1 through 11. Now, what do you make of things like this when you get them? You have particularly blatant examples of it in 1 through 11. This kind of contradiction has bothered people since the beginning. There are a number of ways to try to think about it. The first is to say that theologically there really is no difference here at all. This requires simply ignoring what the plain text says at spots and trying to argue it away in one way or another. The other way of doing it is to say that the source critics were right and that what we have here is the early material represented by the Yahwist, which had already become authoritative for the community by the time the priestly writers started writing. And therefore the priestly writer was stuck with it. He couldn't get rid of it, and the best he could do was to edit it in some way. Another way of coming at the problem is to say that the people in that time period when they wrote just weren't bothered by this kind of contradiction. With the rise of literary criticism or narrative criticism in the modern period, that explanation has gotten to be fairly popular, that people in antiquity either didn't notice or didn't care when these kinds of conflicts appeared in the narrative. This is highly unlikely, although it does seem to be true. We have examples of it from Mesopotamia and the Gilgamesh epic, for example, where it appears that the last tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, which we have in the first example of that text that was published, was seen by scholars from the very beginning to be an addition to the series of tablets. It duplicates other material, it contradicts other material. It looks, in short, very much like what we have in our biblical text. And yet there it is. And when we began to find other texts of the epic, we found some of them do not contain the 12th tablet. So people have said, well, they must have tolerated this kind of problem literarily and just put it there, which leads to another explanation for this kind of issue, which is that they were simply trying to include everything that they had. So the editors of our final text sort of had a box labeled creation with all this material in it, and they wanted us to know everything they knew about it, and so everything in the box goes in there, whether it makes sense in context or not. Now, I have to say the problem is not quite so dramatic as that when you look at it in its present context, but that kind of explanation was seriously advanced, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, by various authors. W.F. Albright was one of the famous ones who made that kind of argument, and it has resurfaced in some versions of the neo-Wellhausenist view that you get this kind of contradiction in content precisely because they were simply trying to include everything that they had. Maybe so, but we can't really say because we don't know enough about the process by which it came. I think a more fruitful theological way of thinking about this is to swallow hard when you get to the outright contradiction and simply say that since this material is trying to tell us something profound about the nature of the deity and the human condition, that all of it is in some way true, and that people have two sides to them. On the one hand, they are dust from the ground and capable of innate evil. On the other hand, they are created in the divine image and can be genuinely good. People are not easily categorized, and for that reason, they act in the world in different ways, and the trick is to get them to act in a good way and not in an evil way. But that is part of the ongoing condition and seems to be what the deity wants of people. As we said a minute ago, God does not seem to want a relationship in which people's reaction to the deity are controlled by the deity. Rather, it is an action of free will, and what God wants from people is a free reaction to what God otherwise wants. Keep that in mind, because it's going to be dramatized for us when we get along to look at the Jacob story. But before we get there, we have to deal with the Abraham stories. Now, when we deal with the ancestral stories, we are in a way in a different world than we are in the primeval history. The difference between the two types of literature has often been noted. The early form critics referred to chapters 1 through 11 as myth, in the sense of stories that give us a profound insight into the nature of reality, what is really real, what the deity really is, who people really are, how the relationship between the two is supposed to work. And it's this kind of look into the way that reality functions that characterizes myth. This is what people tell these kinds of stories to dramatize. And so we get some pretty serious theological and anthropological reflection in going on in chapters 1 through 11. This is a pretty carefully worked out series of ideas about reality and what it's about. When we get to the ancestral stories, we are dealing with a different kind of material. Gunkel, the first of the form critics, simply referred to this material as Saga in German, taken over from the Scandinavian word saga, which in turn we have taken over in English. And it simply means an oral story and dramatizes the idea that this material was originally in an oral form before it was written down. So these are stories about the ancestors that, according to Gunkel, were transmitted from generation to generation within Israelite culture. And so he doesn't say any more about Saga as a formal category than that. And that is why, when Gunkel is looked at in his total work, the work on the Psalms probably best exemplifies the utility of his form critical approach. Trying to apply it on narrative is much harder, as you will discover in the discussion groups this week when we look at form criticism and how it works out in narrative material. It is much more difficult to do that. There is one characteristic, or two characteristics, that Gunkel highlighted with this kind of material that we will notice. One is the fact that this material is generally short in compass. We don't get, until we get to the Joseph story, we don't get a long, well-developed narrative of the sort that we would recognize as a modern narrative. So the material that we have in the ancestral stories tends to be quite brief, and this is particularly true in the Abraham stories. The Jacob stories have been developed a bit more into 2 cycles of stories, and I'll talk more about that on Wednesday. But in the Abraham stories, what we get are little vignettes of Abraham's life. We don't get much in the Abraham story in the way of character development. And most of this material, I should also say, comes from the Yahwist. With the exception of the Joseph material, the rest of Genesis is mostly the way the Yahwist gives it to us. So it becomes the basic narrative of the Pentateuch at this point. Priestly additions to it rarely rise to the level of importance that they do in Genesis 1 through 11 with these big blocks of additions. So what we're getting here really is a book that is pretty well shaped by the Yahwist writer. Once in a while, this mysterious Elohist, who seems otherwise more or less parallel to the Yahwist, the Elohist weighs in with something, but the differences are minor and often difficult to detect. This is why lots of people think that the Elohist is not really a full literary source, although the modern Wellhausenists think it is, and that case has been made by Joel Baden, probably the best defense of the existence of the Elohist. I certainly believe in the Elohist, but not as a full literary source. Joel does. So that is a difference which we will just let lie there. The Elohist does seem to have some demonstrable literary characteristics, but other people have drawn different conclusions from the way these sources are put together, and there is nothing terribly important for the Elohist to say as long as we are in Genesis. When we get to Exodus, we'll see a different pattern. We will get some Elohist material that is quite important and seems to be representative of all 3 sources. All 3 literary sources are represented there, and possibly 4. But what we get with the Abraham stories is simply brief stories about Abraham's actions. There's very little about character in the Abraham stories. We have no idea who he is, in a way. Whereas we'll get a very distinct picture of Jacob in the Jacob material. There is a lot of internal dialogue. There is a lot of dialogue between the main character and the people around him, which helps us to fill out the picture of Jacob. Not so with Abraham. We have no idea what Abraham is thinking, why he is doing what he is doing. But a typical Abraham story simply begins with a notice that Abraham went to a certain place, and at that place he did this or that, or certain things happened to him, and then he goes to some other place, and something else happens. So the pieces of the narrative are strung together with a so-called itinerary notice. That is, Abraham went from X to Y, and in Y something else happens to him, and then he goes from Y to Z, and something else happens, and so on. He seems to be wandering, which is the main theological takeaway from the story. Abraham is not going to be the recipient of the fulfillment of the promise. He is simply wandering. And he's wandering around in the land that will eventually be given to his descendants, but he is not going to be the direct recipient of that. And so it may well be that the way in which the stories are put together signals this kind of wandering activity. It's quite deliberate. You can try to track it on a map if you want to. It's a kind of interesting exercise to see where these places are, but they don't add up to anything. He's not going anywhere. And when he does, he mostly gets in trouble. And that leads to another observation, that some of this material seems to be based on a rather limited supply of stories about Abraham and what is going on. We really don't have much, and it's the repetition of stories that leads you to think that these people need to have a little more information about Abraham than in fact they have. The parade example of that is the so-called wife-sister stories. And what is important about the wife-sister stories is that they are fundamentally the same story. There are 3 different tellings of that story in the Abraham and Isaac material. And they are essentially the same story, and not only that, the people who put them together know that they are the same story. And they reference each other. They are aware that they are repeating the story. And they try to differentiate between the stories, but it's clearly a kind of second-order reflection on what is going on. What is more important is the location of these stories within the overall collection of Abraham's stories. So in chapter 12, we have just hit what is the theological high point of the story as far as Abraham is concerned. When God says, "Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to a land that I will show you, or you go so that I may make of you a great nation." The promise of being a great nation is dependent in the Hebrew text, not so in the translations. Here the translations are simply wrong. They don't get it. But there is a purpose clause there, so that I may make you a great nation. The making of the great nation is dependent on the going, and Abraham went. That's his high point theologically in the entire story. What does he do? He goes for no particularly good logical reason, except that the deity tells him to go. Now, in the context of the Yahwist narrative in 1 through 11, that's a great improvement. In 1 through 11, people have been told by the deity to do things, and they virtually never do them. Don't eat the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden. How long did that last? So we don't get the notion that these early people are obedient. They mostly are thinking how to do the best for themselves, and they don't always see possible negative consequences that may arise from doing this. Not so with Abraham. Abraham's chief moral feature is obedience. And so it appears that in the Abraham cycle, the writer is going to explore what it means to be obedient to the deity, and whether this will be the kind of relationship between humans and the deity that God really wants. Is this the way God wants people to be? Does Abraham rise to the level of being a moral example for people to follow? Well, it doesn't always look that way. And so the first story, connected story that we get is in chapter 12, verse 10, which is the first of these wife-sister stories. And moral is not an adjective that ought to be used to describe it. Abraham has now received a promise of land and descendants, and immediately jeopardizes the fulfillment of that promise through this cockamamie idea that he gets, which is purely self-serving and self-protective. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now this is a common experience. Egypt, because its agriculture depends on the rise of the Nile, which rises every year, at least until the Aswan Dam stopped it. And it rises every year, and therefore people who have to depend on agriculture that is based on the rain cycle, where you can have several years of low rain and wipe out crops, people like that don't have the kind of certainty that they did in Egypt with the rise of the Nile. Sometimes the Nile rises higher than other times, but the Nile always rises, and there are priestly rituals every year to be sure that the Nile is going to rise, and what do you know, it always does, to one degree or another. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful to behold, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and then they will kill me, but let you live." Now, this requires some imagination, as we'll see as the story goes on. Abraham is pushing 80 at this point, and Sarah is said to be about 5 years earlier in the later narrative. He's 75, she's 70. Nevertheless, she is a woman beautiful to behold, which is a nice thing to say at age 70. But he's really worried about it. You may ask, just how beautiful was she? And there's a whole chapter of the Genesis Apocryphon devoted to explaining how this is a reasonable fear on the part of Abraham, and that she was really, really beautiful, and so on. And then this pushes the rabbis to say, who were other beautiful women that you know, and so on. And off they go, listing various people, not always the obvious ones, but various people who fit that category. Let's call this a little side eddy on in the interpretive tradition. So Abraham is worried about this. And sure enough, Abraham entered Egypt, and the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And then the princes of Pharaoh saw it, and they praised her to Pharaoh, and so the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. She becomes part of the royal harem. This is a miscalculation on the part of Abraham, to put it mildly. And you, dear reader, would like to know immediately, well, what happened then? What occurred in the harem? This is an important theological issue. Abraham is to be the father of a great nation. Is it going to be through Sarah that he will be the father, or is it going to be the Pharaoh of Egypt who is the father of the great nation? This is about the worst thing that our writer, who doesn't really like Egyptians anyway, can think about. But notice that the Yahweh is not going to resolve this problem for us. Lots of unanswered questions here that we would really like to know the answers to. For her sake, Pharaoh dealt well with Abraham, and he had sheep and oxen, and he has his men servants, maid servants, she has his camels. He's really doing well economically because of this, and so he does not see anything wrong with this idea. The early church fathers just had all sorts of fits about this sort of character development that's going on here. But notice that the Yahweh is just not going to resolve this for us. Yahweh, however, is said to have not liked this at all because of the way that it jeopardizes the promise that has been made. But we are never told exactly what happened. And so he sends plagues on the house of Pharaoh because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called to Abram and said, "What is this you have done? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Notice where the moral responsibility lies in this story. It is not with Abraham. It is with this supposedly pagan Pharaoh who is the one who raises the moral issue in the story. Lest we should say that the ancestors are all innately moral. Now then, here is your wife, take her and get out of here. We still have not had a resolution to our question, what happened in the Egyptian harem. So Pharaoh gave orders concerning him, and they set him on his way with his wife and everything that he had. So he immediately jeopardizes the promise, and whether or not there is any resolution to that is not known. Now he will do this again. He will do this again in Gerar, which is part of the land that he will eventually inherit. The story there, I'm going to take it out of sequence. The story there is in chapter 20, and I want to do it because I want you to see how the two stories are reacting to each other. This story is often thought to be an Elohist story, but only really because the Elohist telling of it has some contradictory material in it, and it's probably contradiction that is encouraging people to see this as another literary source. So in chapter 20, from there Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and dwelt in Kadesh, and then he journeyed to Gerar, and Abraham said of Sarah, "She is my sister." Well, we notice that this story leaves out the rationale. We are supposed to remember that from the first story. So they are clearly conscious of the fact that they're telling the same story over again. And Avimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Avimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You are a dead man, because the woman you have taken is another man's wife." Notice that it is the deity now who intervenes, and intervenes immediately. So the answer to the question that we wanted answered in the first story is that nothing happened in the harem because God personally intervened, and Avimelech now is simply trapped in what seemed like a perfectly normal sort of exchange. Now, Avimelech had not approached her. You can deduce that from the way the story is told, but the author here is very clear about it. The author knows that you have a question about this, and therefore the author now answers the question for you. Avimelech had not approached her, so he said, now we're going to get a moral discussion between Avimelech, the king of Gerar, and the deity. Again, this question of where is morality located? And in both stories, it is the foreigner who represents the moral point of the story. This is an interesting set of stories about how the other is viewed from the standpoint of the Israelites in these ancestral stories. So Avimelech now says, will you slay an innocent people? Well, presumably the answer that the deity would give to that is no. God won't do anything like that because it's immoral. Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. So for the first time, the fact that Sarah is personally involved in this is explicit. This was not explicit in the first telling of the story, where Sarah really had nothing to say about this strange arrangement. Here, we are told that both of them are equally guilty of trying to fool the king of Gerar. In the integrity of my heart, he continues, and the innocence of my hands I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yeah, I know that, which was why I was the one who kept you from sinning against me. An interesting portrayal of the deity here. The deity cares not only about the morality of Israelites, but cares about the morality of the foreigners as well, and has intervened to make sure that Avimelech does not sin against the deity. It's a really interesting story. I did not let you touch her. Now then restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you. Why? What's the problem? Well, it assumes that there has been an affliction of the people because of this event. That's narrated in the first story, but it is not narrated here. It is assumed here. And it assumes that you remember that God does things like that in these kinds of stories. So they're very clearly aware of the existence of the first story. And they let that material color the way that they are telling this one. So Avimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all of this. The people were very much afraid, and Avimelech called Abraham and said, "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me these things that ought not be done. What were you thinking of?" So we get a moral lecture now here from Avimelech to Abraham. It is a really interesting story. Now there's a third example of this, which is not an Abraham story. It's in chapter 26, beginning 1 through 11. It involves our old friend Avimelech again, who by this time has had enough of these Israelites. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the famine that was in the days of Abraham. So again, the consciousness of the first story. They're telling the same story over again, and they know that. So they want you to know that they know it. There was famine in the land besides the one that was in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, and the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land where I tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. I will fulfill the oath that I swore to Abraham, your ancestor," and so on. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept... This is an Isaac story. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him about his wife, and he said, "She is my sister." For he feared to say my wife, thinking the men of this place should kill me for the sake of Rebekah. Same thinking in the part of the son as in the part of the father. This is all. So needless to say that we have a tradition also about Rebekah being one of the most beautiful women in the world, and so on. So Avimelech called Isaac and said, why does he know that she is his wife? Because he looks out the window and saw them fondling each other. What a quaint kind of moral judgment in the modern period. They must be married. I mean, what else would you think? And so he immediately deduces that they are married and proceeds to confront Isaac with this, and they have the same kind of moral discussion that was held previously, and Avimelech again throws them out, and they go on to another story. So threefold telling of the same story, and in each case the narrative function of the story is the same. It is an indication that Abraham first and then Isaac is fully capable of nullifying the promise that has been given of land and descendants, or fulfilling it in a way that God does not intend. That theme is developed even more in the Abraham story than it is in the Isaac story. We really don't have many stories about Isaac, except the crucial one, which is the ultimate fulfillment of nullifying the promise, namely the command by the deity to sacrifice Isaac. And to really appreciate the impact of that story in the chain of events that lead finally to the fulfillment of the promise, we'll have to go back and look at the other events of the Abraham material. We'll do that and then move on to Jacob next time.